welcome to Agrifrica.com, the news and content publishing platform focusing on agriculture, energy, and environment.
Seed saving is all about sex. And humans are all obsessed with sex, even if it's rutabaga sex.
My sweetheart.
This is right up there with making love to your spouse.
Seeds are so crafty.
The diversity in our seed stocks is as endangered as a panda or a polar bear right now.
We are hugely vulnerable with all of those seeds.
When we invaded Iraq, we destroyed that seed bank, and we destroyed the great ancient seeds that had been collected for the benefit of mankind.
Thank you so much, John Betz and Taggart Siegel. So John, there you go, so we can see who is who. Thank you so much for accepting this interview request to discuss about your film, Seed, the Untold Story.
I'll go first. I'm Taggart Siegel, and I've been making films for 35 years or so, and it's been a long journey. I started with many of the cultural documentaries of refugees coming into America, such as the Hmong from Southeast Asia. They're from the mountain people way up in Laos and Thailand, and they came to America in like 1982, 83, and I started this documentary seeing how refugees that lived way remotely in these communities way up in the mountains and lived in an oral tradition, and how they farmed and how they did spiritual work. Many of them are shamans that brought their ancestral heritage to America, sort of dropped into America, which is quite a shocking thing. So that sort of took me on this journey of filming many refugee groups, Laotians and Hmong, and then even got into different gang communities in Chicago. But then I took this really, I started going more into the environmental movement, and I started with The Real Dirt on Farmer John, which is a film about a farmer losing his family farm and getting it back, and then restoring the land, becoming an organic farmer and a biodynamic farmer. And from there, John and I joined forces, and we made Queen of the Sun, What Are the Bees Telling Us? And that's a real pivotal, more environmental film, seeing the colony collapse disorder of honeybees and what is causing the honeybee collapse, and realizing this is one of the most important issues of our time. If we can't save the honeybee, we really can't save ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that sort of flourished more into all these chemical companies and seed companies kind of in bed with each other, and pharmaceutical companies, and how they were doing some devastating poisoning of the earth, including killing honeybees and insects. And then that moved into Seed, the Untold Story, which I could pass over to John to tell that story.
Queen of the Sun began this sort of bigger picture look, going from a single farmer and Farmer John to, a whole smattering of like amazing, colorful characters, beekeepers all around the world. And we continued that same sort of approach with Seed, the Untold Story. It seemed to be a really great way to tell sort of these global stories that affect all of us in still an intimate, character-driven way, by seeing how these different people are sort of these unsung heroes of our agriculture. And of course, they're the farmers, but in the case of Seed, the Untold Story, they're the seed keepers, which are something that most of us have never heard of. A seed keeper, what's a seed keeper? And so we didn't know either. That's how we start. We start always sort of opening a box and saying, what's inside? And so I remember Taggart brought a Xerox from National Geographic and just put it on my desk one morning. He said, I think that might be our next film. And he didn't know how true those words were. It was the Svalbard Seed Bank up in Norway, on an island sort of north of Norway, and this Arctic, jutting out of this Arctic ice is the Doomsday Seed Vault. We thought, Doomsday Seed Vault, that sounds like it could be a film. And so we just dove into this world through like history and time and cultures, all the way back to sort of like the history of agriculture and mythologies and religions and the Garden of Eden, and just really looking at where our food comes from. And we found these incredible people. And so we follow these seed keepers, we follow environmental activists, we follow organic and sustainable farmers, as they begin to share this message of how they have been working in hidden ways to save our agriculture. And we found out this astounding statistic that 93% of our seed diversity, by a research paper in the 1980s, found that 93% of our seed diversity had been lost because so many people had abdicated farming. And so much in the ways that the colony collapse disorder of bees was sort of prompted by a message of disappearance and extinction, maybe the threat of extinction. In the same way, looking at our seed diversity and saying, well, I eat just fine. How is it that my seeds are disappearing, and what does that mean for me?
So how long did it take you to make the documentary, to produce it? I mean, to script it to a certain degree, to identify the subjects, and to actually get the budget to the final post-production and then distribution?
It took about 3 years, maybe a little over 3 years. And a lot of that time is preparing grants, writing many, many grants to environmental agencies or foundations that support agriculture. And there's not as many as you think there are. But so we went for the traditional kind of like applying for grants from film foundations, but also agricultural foundations. And it's a very lengthy process. You have to wait often for months to hear back from them. And you know, sometimes we ran out of money and we had to raise money again, and we world, because it was a global film, and we had to hire like camera people in other countries because we couldn't go to Svalbard seed vault up in the Arctic. They wouldn't allow us in at that time, so we had somebody that lived nearby go and film. It was a 3-year process, and I have to say that it was every minute we were thinking about it.
Man, a lot of the independent filmmakers out in the world like us who aren't working for a broadcaster or a big streaming service, you know, this is a very much a labor of love, and it's so huge the support that people can bring, you know, to these stories that sometimes are extremely important, but you wouldn't know about them just watching the news every day. They're not part of like that, you know, they're not that big headline that everyone wants to hear, but we need more information about that. So we found ways to do it, and I'm really proud of what we did.
And so what are your thoughts about, since you both mentioned the issue of the funding and working with a lot of independent filmmakers, I understand the challenges of funding. So, and Taggart, you mentioned that you would be surprised to know that there aren't enough institutions or organizations that fund agricultural focused documentaries, researchers, or whatnot. Can you briefly touch upon that in terms of what are your thoughts?
Well, funding is always tricky, and John could speak into this also, but with organizations like the Calipea Foundation that was so generous to us, they just kept giving us more money when we needed to film more or to do outreach. And outreach is a very, very key part of getting a film out in the world. You probably heard about it because of some form of outreach. So outreach foundations are often very willing to help out once the film is complete.
So what is it that you learned about the seed that is important for farmers and also for the industry investors?
Wow, seeds are so foundational. Like we chart through, how they're sort of the foundation of all life, right? But then we really zero in on the last 100 years or so, really looking at the modernization of farming. And I think there's a few big messages we communicate one in the film. One is that diversity is resiliency. In farming, it's very much go big or go home these days. And so it's, investing in equipment and going into debt and getting bigger land and doing more at once and volume, volume, volume. And I think what we realize in the film is that there is an incredible amount of fragility to our farm system, not just from one farmer managing so much land and maybe going bankrupt or whatever. That land can still be managed again, but it's from buying and using seeds that are from such narrow genetic stock. And what I mean by that is because of the corporate consolidation of seed companies that happened in the last 100 years, starting with hybrids, and sort of what happened is every farmer would save years to years, generation for thousands and thousands of years, right? And then what happened is in just 100 years, it totally changed because companies, capitalist, for-profit companies would come in and they would say, hey, we have a way to create a seed that just gives a little more juice or is a little more resistant to this, or grows better this way, or produces bigger fruit. And we've created it through this process of hybridizing. But the hybridizing process was such a way that you couldn't save a seed from a hybrid and grow it again the next year. It wouldn't grow the same. And so that allowed the companies that created these hybrids to control the genetic properties, so to speak. Right. And so what they were able to do is you had to buy it from them. And so they grew bigger and bigger. And what happens is as they grew bigger and bigger, the smaller seed companies that did it the old way and did it with what we call heirloom seeds all got gobbled up. And then over the last 100 years, you have just a handful of companies that are now called agro corporations that have the most money, but they have the most money in large part from selling chemicals for agriculture, fertilizers, pesticides. And now those same companies also have bought up the seed companies that now don't just make hybrids, which can't reproduce, and which they are the people that can sell and they do all the research on, but now they have begin to genetically modify the seeds. Why do they genetically modify them? Generally speaking, the money that's put behind genetic modification is to create seeds that can withstand more pesticide spray and more fertilizer. Well, the downside of that is that those pesticides and those fertilizers are destroying the soil, which is even
seed keeper that we came across that had love for seeds. They would tear up holding the seeds. Amigdio Balan from Bolivia, who works with the native people in southern United States, he told a story that his grandfather said, hold on to these seeds. They're worth more than money. They're everything. And our mission was to hear the voices of the seed keepers that came before us, that are really holding on a tradition that could die out. Literally, many of these old varieties, if they're not planted year to year, they can die out. So you see somebody like Will Bonzel at the beginning of the film with his long beard, and he's talking about Noah's Ark. He feels like all the seeds need to get onto the ship or the boat to be preserved, because he doesn't know what's going to be good in the future, whether that one seed that he saved might be the seed that is really good for drought. If the local people aren't keeping their seeds, they're giving themselves up to this corporate power. And that's when they often go into debt, such as in India, where many, over 250,000 farmers have committed suicide because they get into that hybrid, got to buy inputs, got to buy tractors. Suddenly they're like overwhelmed by it and they lose all their money, and then they drink the pesticide, insecticide that was given them to put on the land.
So what are your thoughts about government regulations? This is something that I discussed in my prior interview in terms of government regulation, and because they can recalibrate all of these issues. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting in the United States, the amount of subsidies that are given to farmers. It's very complicated economically, but the reality is that a lot of those subsidies are given to large scale agriculture to support enterprises that are not necessarily inherently profitable, but you require the subsidies to survive. And so essentially, the government's supporting forms of agriculture to grow and subsidizing the things that they want more things grown of. Well, what are they subsidizing heavily? Corn and soy. Why? Not to eat them, to feed cattle, right? So that we can eat beef. So the meat industry, the whole diet, the whole like push is for a certain type of food system and a certain type of outcome. We're finding out is that that's very destructive for us when eaten in large scale. It's the fast food industry that's fueling a lot of that. And so government regulation could be helpful for re-steering that, right? If you can provide, how about some of those kind of subsidies to support things that are long-term fruitful, even though they're short-term more difficult?
Well, if you look at NAFTA and the whole green revolution, it's as we address in Seed the Untold Story, the green revolution wasn't about making things more green. It was actually fighting communism. But what the companies that got involved were very big corporations that actually started going into Mexico and India and having many of the regulations controlled by the corporations, working very closely with the government, saying this wheat is better than your wheat. Only, like, they actually had wheat grown in Mexico where corn is where corn comes from, in the Oaxaca Valley. 8,000 years ago, corn was growing there, and they've always carried on their corn tradition. But our government in the Green Revolution saying wheat, you got to grow wheat. And it's just this kind of ridiculous system that we put in place and force onto other countries. And we subsidize the corn so much in Mexico from America that we undermine the peasant farmer, the farmer that was just getting by anyway, but would actually, our corn was less expensive, and many farmers went out of business. And then many of the farmers had to come north to United States to live in because
during this discussion, you have also expressed that some seeds that are already in the market right now, you planted and it actually erodes the soil. And so even your soil can actually won't be fertile anymore year to year. And there's data that shows that there's less fertile soil on the planet, and the arable land is decreasing. So do you want to touch upon that if you have had the chance to have a deeper dive with some of the farmers that you've interviewed, or even through your research?
Those are even more reason for us, from the lens of the film, to look and say, okay, the greenwashing is the term that a lot of the agrochemical companies say we need to do this to feed the world, right? This is the way to feed the world, and we got to do it our way to feed the world. But what really is, it's their way. It's their way for them to make money, and it's their way to build on their intellectual property and their identities and brands and what they do best, which is to repackage chemicals from World War II originally and sell them as pesticides. And this whole revolution was called the Green Revolution. It was called feeding the world. And the reality is, you could feed the whole world multiple times over, growing food in sustainable ways. Permaculturists, agroecologists have done tons of work on this. There is ways to much more intensively farm in a more diverse way, but it won't fit the cultural push that we have, which is to mechanize and industrialize and to divorce ourselves from the land and sort of to connect more deeply with the land. So that was sort of our operating paradigm, and the soil played into that for us.
The missionaries actually came in and bought the land in the 1800s. And a lot of this land right now is from the missionary owners from the 1800s. and they used to have all the sugar plantations that were like that were doing very well in the early 1900s all the way until the 60s, 70s, and then the sugar plantation started going down and they started going out of business. And then what replaced that was Monsanto, Dow, Syngenta coming in to do seed test plots in Hawaii, just the most gorgeous places on earth almost. And here they are, like literally sterilizing the soil in order to plant the seed, the genetically modified seed into the soil. If the soil can't have microbes, it can't, they killed the soil in order so they could put their inputs in and their chemicals. And this is what we've seen with industrial agriculture, is that the soil is getting destroyed, creates more erosion that goes into the Mississippi River and Delta and goes into the Gulf of Mexico, that all these algae blooms and stuff. So soil is really everything.
Monsanto now owns a quarter of all the world's seeds, along with a couple of other companies. They own about 60% of all the world's commercial seeds.
You've taken seed that has been there for thousands of years and put a patent on it and say you own it. Basically, it's robbery.
The threat is there to pan our seeds. We're the custodians of this knowledge in the corn. And how dare others take it away?
The seed that we use to grow our food is owned by chemical companies, by pesticide and pharmaceutical companies.
They are spraying things at night while we're sleeping. My two daughters wake up with blood-soaked pillows.
I just want to stop the poisoning. Bring a baby into the world that's got to get cut open right away.
The future of Hawaii is all at stake. Say something or die.
I've heard these companies talk about patenting seed. We need to protect the diversity and freedom of life. Give seed its own freedom so that we as humans can have our freedom.
Which country impacted you the most?
But it's hard to separate what's just my personal impact, but it was very, very impacting to visit for me, and to just see the level of farming that happens, the amount of farmers that are farming in India.
And Taggart?
For me, it was India also, but my other place that I loved filming was Mexico. Going to Oaxaca, to the source of where corn came from. And it's very magical and almost mystical when you're down there and you're hearing people talk about seeds, corn especially, and how corn is kind of like any food that comes from the wild and then is almost a gift to us so we could feed ourselves. Think of wheat, think of corn, think of millet, think of all these hands that helped form the seeds that we now take for granted.
So in terms of the 3D printed food, what are your thoughts about that?
It's the first time I've heard of that. The film's been out for a couple years now, and so I have to admit I haven't even heard of that. The gene editing was the last thing that we were really focusing on, was splicing genes and editing very specific pieces of material. The 3D printing just kind of blows my mind to think that you're literally standing on dirt that can grow it, it just seems wild to me.
Taggart, do you have any views about that? Or
when I read articles or glance or hear about these kind of things, I'm shocked that something would be grown. I think they grow them in petri dishes or something.
Yes,
and
exactly.
Growing food that yes, on the spreadsheet looks very positive, and could feed millions and millions of people, but who's it benefiting?
So you made this movie in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. Any new projects that you're working on that you'd like to share?
Believe it or not, I've kind of, with COVID and everything, I've kind of just taken a back seat to going out and filming. So I'm really looking at my life in a very different way. I love making films, possibly, but I'm actually helping students at a school to make local films. And there's a little bird sanctuary right near our home. And I love the idea of just walking out the house instead of traveling all the way to India or New Zealand or Africa, even though I'd love to go to these places again. I really love that what's in our backyard.
I think for me, interestingly, I think, it was a huge undertaking to make both films, and we very much enjoyed it. And a huge part of ourselves is there. But I actually am becoming a pastor. I'm pastoring. And so it's very much a local vision and just caring for people. And I think one of the things actually, with some hindsight, with the film is this just, caring for the local, caring for what's around you. You know what I mean?
So these are seeds of hope.
What if there's all kinds of other seeds in nature that have the potential for food production? Sweet?
What's it taste like?
Tastes terrible.
Does it taste bad?
Yeah.
I'm appreciative of your time and very susceptible to your time as well. In terms of what is the one thing that you foresee that will change in regards to seed? So in order to close it on a hopeful note, and how the next generation will be able to embrace the importance of seed.
I'm very excited about organizations I really believe in. There's the Gaia Foundation that actually is in Africa, and they're doing some great work locally where the elders are teaching people all about, weaving and seed keeping and storytelling and bringing back that local sense of heritage. That's the most exciting thing to me. So when I look at like Rocky Mountain Seed Alliance, where Bill McDormand has spent his whole life almost loving seeds, and they've started this wheat kamut seed saving heritage, where anybody who wants to be involved in it can grow the kamut seed to adapt in those local environments. So then you send half that your what you grow back to the organization, and then they could distribute those seeds back to farmers that are trying to farm locally. And that's very exciting to me to see that seed schools are starting.
The thing that I think would be interesting, especially perhaps for everyone listening, is heirloom seed companies. Where do you buy your gardening seeds from? There's a huge resurgence in heirloom seed companies that are a big part of this system of maintaining the diverse agriculture, because these heirloom seeds are the ones that were passed down for generation and generations. You can get purple potatoes, and you can get, radishes that like have pink and white exploding with stripes inside. You just incredible, the look of the food, the taste of the food, tons of different kinds of carrots, and you can buy them for just a few bucks and grow them in your garden. And I think, to me, there's a huge hopefulness in teaching my kids and other people gardening to grow these kinds of foods so that we actually desire them. And sometimes now in stores, we live in Portland, Oregon in the United States, and sometimes stores will have different varieties of things because there's demand for it. There needs to be the demand. If we know what we're missing, then we might ask for it to be there. And I think
Taggart, Siegel, John Betz, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for allowing me to interview you, and wishing you a wonderful day.